he calls his disciples and he tells them, look in verse 2. He calls his disciples to him and he says, I have compassion on the multitude. He tells them that he has compassion. Why does he need to tell them? What difference does it make? He tells them for a couple of reasons. First, I think he's telling the disciples this, and I think he's telling us this as well. I have compassion on them, and so should you. And we don't have any recording of what the disciples said or didn't say here, but it would be within their character or in their nature for them to say, hey, remember what they did with the 5,000? When Jesus went to them and said, what are we going to do? They said, well, I don't know, send them home. Not very compassionate, right? It's like living with a nurse. I'm sick. Well, you're breathing? Okay, probably live. Probably. Right, Benson? It's tough, isn't it? I know, man. And so Jesus is saying, I have compassion. You should have compassion. And I think he's telling us the same thing today. We need to look at the multitudes around us. We need to not become so jaded and angry at a sinful and lost world that we lose our sense of compassion. Let me tell you something. It's easy to be frustrated when we look at the world, isn't it? It's easy to be angry about the sin and the situations that people find themselves in. It's easy to throw our hands up in the air and say, well, if you're going to be like that, then what in the world can I do for you? If you're going to do that, you made the bed, sleep in the bed, right? Maybe we haven't said it, but we've thought it. I've said it. Said, man, listen, if that's the way they're going to live, just let them live that way. We can't let our hearts become so hardened that we lose the same compassion that Jesus had. Jesus could have said, well, why didn't you bring food? Don't you normally get hungry after a couple of days? What are you thinking? He doesn't do that. He looks at them and he says, I recognize your suffering in the moment of your suffering, and I have compassion on you. And we must do that. We must continue to do that. We must do it in both ways. Here's the problem with churches today. Okay? Here's the problem sometimes even with our church today, that we need to make sure we understand. Jesus has compassion on these people in two ways, spiritually and physically. You can't just do one or the other. But the problem is that both of them are difficult. We've seen in lots of different areas and lots of different places, just within our local body, that it is difficult to feed spiritually and to feed physically, if you will, or take care of those physical needs. I can't come up to someone who is struggling physically and completely ignore it and tell them that I love them. That's not love. I cannot come up to someone who's starving and say, well, I have compassion on you. Can I read this Bible verse to you? It's not compassion. On the flip side, I can't do the other either. I can't come up to the person who's struggling spiritually and say, well, our church offers food. I don't need bread. I need Jesus. And so if we're going to be people who are compassionate, if we're going to be people who love our neighbors, if we're going to be people who do local missions, we must be people who are providing spiritual food and physical food that are having compassion on both sides of the person. We have to certainly, listen, don't get me wrong, we put a priority on spiritual food. That's the business that we're in here. That's what we do. We put a priority on the gospel. We put a priority on the spiritual side of life. But to only do that and to ignore the physical sufferings of people is not the way Jesus loved these people.